Ralph Elliott, my uncle by marriage, was married to my Aunt Annie Kirkendall in 1931. We moved from New Mexico in 1952 when I was 5 years old, so I only saw Uncle Ralph and Aunt Annie a few times in my life. Aunt Annie was much more gregarious than him, so I got to know her better. I even corresponded with her some about family history and family pictures. It was easy to understand why everyone in the family seemed to love her. The only time I can remember talking to my Uncle Ralph was around 1990 at a family reunion, and that conversation was brief. My loss. Most of the information in the pictures that follow come from my cousin, Uncle Ralph's son, Robert Bruce Elliott, and I'm very grateful for his contribution. This is a story of the unlikely connection between a mechanic in the small town of Vaughn, New Mexico, and Charles Lindbergh. After the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903, America and the world became obsessed with flight. Setting flying distance records grew and ultimately became a greater challenge as the distance required to set a new record increased. If you haven't watched the Jimmy Stewart movie, The Spirit of St. Louis, you should. In May of 1919, Raymond Ortiz, a wealthy hotelier, offered $25,000, the equivalent of $373,000 in 2020, to the first aviator or aviators to make a nonstop flight from New York to Paris or vice versa. This increased the flying obsession that had captivated the world. 9 men died trying to claim the prize before Charles Lindbergh succeeded. Charles Lindbergh was born in 1902, a year later than Ralph Elliott. Lindbergh began flying in 1922, and just 5 years later, in May of 1927, he made his world-famous 33.5-hour solo flight of 3,610 miles from New York to Paris. The frenzy of publicity around Lindbergh that followed probably helped to encourage Ralph Elliott's desire to learn to fly. In 1928, Ralph began trading mechanics work to a local pilot, James Chrisman, for flying lessons. He was training in the standard J-1 biplane pictured here. Fate came calling on July 30th, 1928, when Charles Lindbergh was flying a Curtiss Falcon mailplane over Vaughn, New Mexico, a small town of less than 1,000 people. His engine failed and he was forced to make a dead stick landing. Of course, there were no aircraft mechanics in Vaughn, but there was one mechanic in town with some experience working on airplanes. That mechanic was Ralph Elliott, so he was given the job of replacing the engine in Lindbergh's plane. A new engine was shipped by rail from Buffalo, New York. Ralph installed it and Lindbergh was on his way. Unfortunately, as you can see from the above flight log entry of August 1928, the plane was later flown to ground in fog and rain by another pilot. It crashed, killing the pilot and passenger. Ralph continued his flying lessons and soloed September 25, 1928. Shortly thereafter, he purchased a surplus Lincoln Standard LS-5, tail number 4760, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and flew it home. It turns out this airplane probably had a further connection to Charles Lindbergh. It seems Lindbergh got his start in aviation in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1922. He was one of the few pupils in the factory where the plane was built at the time it was built. It is likely that he ferried the plane from the factory to Colorado Springs, where it was put in service for Colorado Airways, Co-Air. It was their flagship plane, and on May 31, 1926, it delivered the first mail to Denver. Under the wings on either side of the fuselage of Ralph's plane are dual radiators. The original standard J-1, which Ralph learned to fly in, had a four-cylinder engine. It had a single radiator in front of the cockpit. The Lincoln Standard had a six-cylinder, 225 horsepower engine and required the extra cooling. Antoinette Murda is the attractive young lady in Ralph's airplane. Bruce Elliott says when he asked his mom who the girl was in the picture, she said, "That's your dad's girlfriend, Pickles." The group of people around the plane are what Bruce's mom referred to as Ralph's fan club. Ralph used his airplane to fly from Vaughn, New Mexico to the Kirkendall's ranch to court his future bride, Annie. She was scared of heights, didn't like to fly, and didn't want him to fly. Shirley and Bruce say their mom probably only flew with him once or twice. Bruce says he remembers once seeing a plane doing aerobatics over Vaughn. When he got home, he asked his mom if she had seen the plane doing tricks in the sky. In an exasperated tone, she said, "That's your dad up there with one of his friends." Bruce says he doesn't recall that his dad ever flew again. After Ralph and Annie's wedding, Ralph's flying days were over, but I'm sure the memory stayed with him all of his life.